They didn't just fight kings, they bled them dry. Welcome to Viking Valhalla. I'm your host. I'd love to know where this story is reaching. Comment your location below. Your voice makes this ritual echo louder. Let's begin. Before the stories, there was the silence. Not the hush of reverence, but a silence shaped by cold breath and waiting. It moved across the damp moss, curled around the bones beneath ancient mounds, and slipped through the feathered wings of ravens circling overhead. This silence did not soothe. It warned, and still it warns. Far in the north, where light fractures in long arcs across the sky and the earth does not soften easily beneath the foot, there were once women who did not follow the thread. They followed the blade. They did not sit by the hearth, spinning tales for sons and kings. They stood beside kings, steel-bound and weather-worn, and sometimes they stood alone. The sagas may sing of them in riddles if they speak at all. But the land remembers, and the soil, if turned carefully, still lifts secrets from the silence. In burial mounds ringed with stones shaped like ships, in weapons laid to rest where looms were once expected, archaeologists find the uneasy echo of a truth half forgotten. There were women who held power, not borrowed, not granted, taken, wielded, and then buried with sword at their side and no apology for the disruption they once caused. At Birka, a merchant stronghold on the edge of Sweden's ancient heart, a grave was unearthed that refused to behave. At first glance, it was the final rest of a warrior. Full weapon set, 2 horses, and a game board for strategy, not play. But when bone analysis whispered a truth the dirt had long held secret, the revelation pressed gently but firmly against the fragile notions of who had shaped the Viking world. The warrior was a woman, and still the silence persisted. She was not the only one. Across Scandinavia, other graves ripple with similar defiance. Axes tucked near delicate combs, shields resting over slender ribs, bronze brooches beside broken spearheads. It is not contradiction, it is convergence. The sagas, too, remember, though they prefer metaphor to memory. They speak of Lagertha, who fought with her hair unbound. Of Brynhilde, armored in defiance, encircled by flame. Of Hervor, who demanded her father's cursed sword and walked into the land of the dead to claim it. These are not myths meant to comfort. They are shadows of women who left their shape on the earth. Yet modern science, cautious and tender in its approach, has begun to validate the rumblings long felt in the soil. Ancient DNA does not lie, nor does the wear of bones, the stress marks of lived strength, the patterns of trauma healed long before death. There were women who trained, who rode, who struck and were struck, women who bore both weapon and wound. They may not have filled the sagas, but they filled the fields, and they returned not to cradles, but to cairns. The raven, sacred to Odin, flies above this history, watching, waiting, a bird of death, yes, but also of knowledge. In the carved stones of Gotland, we see them, wings outstretched, flanking women who hold staffs or swords. These images do not explain. They do not justify. They remain, etched in granite and in wind, asking only that we remember. Memory in the north is not always spoken. It lives in shape, in rhythm, in ritual. It clings to the threshold between hearth and forest, between birth and burial. The Shieldmaiden, if we dare still call her that, was not born to war. She was drawn to it, not always welcomed, but not always turned away. In the sagas, when men fail, it is often the women who see clearly. They do not always shout, but they act. In Njal's saga, Halgerd whispers vengeance with a calm that outlives flame. In Egil's saga, the poet's daughter refuses to weep, and that refusal shifts everything. The power of these women is not spectacle. It is endurance. It is that quiet edge just beneath the throat, not raised, not bragging, but present. Known. Today, some historians still hesitate. They weigh every burial, every fragment, every broken blade against expectation. They argue over what the presence of weapons truly means. But the sagas are not court documents, and the graves are not lies. When we listen, not to what is shouted, but to what is buried, the story becomes clearer. These were not exceptions. They were possibilities, and the North was wide with them. What we choose to see reflects more than evidence. It reveals what we are willing to believe was possible. The presence of these women in both text and terrain does not rewrite history. It restores it. Layer by layer, grave by grave, word by word, we remember them not for the wars they won, but for the silence they broke. And so, beneath the ravens, in the wind-torn places where fog folds over stone, something stirs. Not glory, not conquest, but aftermath. These were women crowned not in gold, but in survival. Their memory, withheld too long, rises again. Soft, slow, unrelenting, not with trumpets, but with the patient truth of earth disturbed, of bones examined, of breath held. A story not of myth, but of memory returned. In the twilight between history and legend, there lived a tension sharp enough to draw blood. The line between what was sung and what was true blurred, not by error, but by design. For centuries, scholars gazed at the Shieldmaidens of the sagas and saw only the shimmer of myth, too bright to be believed, too dangerous to be real. They were catalogued as Valkyries, the choosers of the slain, imagined women with winged helmets and no weight in the world. Beautiful fiction, they said, a poetic distraction, but the sagas did not whisper fantasy. They whispered memory, and memory, when ignored too long, becomes a blade. From the earliest oral traditions of the Norse, the women who appeared in battle were not always spirits. They had names: Hervor, Heitha, Visna, Lagertha. They had families, rivalries, pride. They bled and were buried. They made choices, not appearances. The distinction is crucial, because while Valkyries descended from the sky, these women walked. They trained, they fought, they commanded fleets and defended homesteads. They were not summoned, they summoned others. To historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries, such figures were troubling. The past, they believed, had rules. Women wept, nurtured, warned, but they did not fight. And if the sagas told otherwise, it must be because the poets were dreaming too wildly or too fondly. A romantic metaphor, an allegory dressed in armor. But the bones, when they surfaced, told colder truths. Archaeological findings began to crack the illusion. Not all warrior graves belonged to men. Some, under the watchful eye of cautious science, revealed female bodies wrapped in martial authority, buried not with cooking tools or beads, but with arrows, axes, and war horses. These burials were not symbolic. They were prepared with intent, with precision, with honor. Someone saw these women as warriors. Not later, but then. And yet the hesitation remained. It was not that the evidence was absent. It was that it resisted alignment with expectation. The shield maiden remained an impossibility. Not because she lacked presence, but because her presence required a rewriting of too many quiet assumptions. That war was only a man's domain. That myth could never be true. That women in the past were somehow simpler, gentler, less divided. But the sagas never promised simplicity. They gave us contradictions deliberately. Hervor, who sought her father's cursed sword, is both brave and doomed. Lagertha, described by Saxo Grammaticus, fights with valor, then disappears into domesticity. Freydis Eiríksdóttir, half hero, half tyrant, is recorded chasing enemies with a drawn sword while pregnant, her screams alone causing them to flee. These women are neither pure nor monstrous. They are too human to be symbolic and too visceral to be reduced to metaphor. The discomfort lies here, not in whether they existed, but in what their existence demands. If the women of the sagas were real, then the old maps of power, gender, and memory must be redrawn. Not with broad strokes, with care, with excavation. In one burial in Denmark, the remains of a woman were found with weapons arranged as if for immediate reach. Near her body, a horse's skull lay facing outward, an omen, perhaps, or a companion. She had been buried with the same rites reserved for those who bore arms and authority. There were no loom weights, no spindle whirls, only steel and silence. Modern science approaches these finds with humility now. Stable isotope analysis tells us what these women ate. DNA confirms their biological sex. Wear patterns on bones hint at horseback riding, combat training, repeated physical strain. This is not speculative fiction. It is evidence long overlooked or dismissed because it was not what scholars had expected to find. But in the North, nothing was ever simple. Identity was layered. The same woman who raised a child could raise a sword. The same voice that sang could command. In a world shaped by winter, where survival demanded strength and cunning, roles did not remain fixed. The sagas reflect that, not because they are fables, but because they remember. To call it myth is to soften its edges, and its edges were sharp. When Shieldmaidens appear in the poetic Edda, in texts like Helgak vida hundingsbana, they do not descend from heaven. They arrive on horseback, fully armed, eyes unflinching. They kill and fall, they love and grieve. They are not spirits, they are consequences. In the Hervarar saga, the titular heroine dons armor to avenge her father, even as her family begs her to stay behind. She argues with ghosts, speaks with fire, and stands where men refuse to go. It is not fantasy, it is a warning and a memory. What makes these stories powerful is not their perfection, but their refusal to be tamed. These women are not idealized. They are conflicted, fierce, and often flawed. Too deadly for folklore, too female for the battlefield, and thus exiled from both. But now, as evidence is unearthed with gentler hands and clearer eyes, the past reshapes, slowly, reverently. What was once dismissed as dream becomes lineage. What was once labeled fiction stands revealed as memory, only obscured by fear of its implications. Because to accept these women as real is to acknowledge that history, too, can be unjust in its silence. That the absence of their names in chronicles was not proof of absence, but proof of erasure. They were there, carving paths through myth and mud, holding blades against both enemy and expectation. When the earth swallowed them, it did not forget, only waited. Now, slowly, the bones speak. The sagas are heard anew, and the myth, too sharp to be fiction, is finally allowed to bleed. This is not revision, it is return. In the North, childhood arrived without mercy. It did not wait to be welcomed. It arrived with wind and hunger, and the hollow echoes of a hall left empty after death. The girl who would one day take up arms was born not into glory, but into necessity. A land shaped by both frost and fire, where grief was inherited alongside land and names. The world into which a shield maiden stepped was not one of dreams. It was made of smoke-stained rafters, of cold wood and colder nights, of salted fish and thin broth. The cradle was often carved by hand, rough-edged and unvarnished, passed down like a warning. Her lullabies were not songs of peace, but the muffled sound of whispered arguments and rain hammering the longhouse roof. Outside, clan disputes unraveled into violence with little notice. Inside, a child's silence could mean survival. A misplaced sound might draw attention, and attention, in times of scarcity, was dangerous. She learned early to listen, to observe, to read the lines etched on adult faces like runes. fear, anger, restraint. Before she spoke fluently, she understood threat. Before she learned poetry, she learned retreat. And when she finally learned to walk, it was between walls that held memory like a wound. Walls that still bore the axe marks of a winter raid long past, never spoken of, but never forgotten. The sagas rarely linger on childhood. They rush toward action, toward legacy. But every shield maiden was once a child, watching. A girl weaving her hair not just in ornament, but in readiness. The braid itself was symbolic. Order brought to chaos. Strands woven tight to avoid obstruction in movement, in battle, in survival. Beauty, yes, but also discipline, even preparation. In this world, girls worked early, not as a punishment, as a requirement. They carried water from icy streams, snapped twigs with cold-reddened hands, rubbed fat into cracked skin until the sting dulled. In some places, they might help with dyeing wool or feeding livestock, but not all girls stayed within the loom's shadow. Some watched the drills outside the longhouse. They lingered when the older boys sparred with sticks. They asked questions their mothers hesitated to answer. And sometimes, they found a way to stay when others were sent in. A girl who wished to hold a weapon had no manual to follow. There were no scrolls of law that welcomed her, but there were moments. Openings, if her father had no sons, if her mother had wielded knowledge instead of needle, if the clan was fractured and in need, if she simply refused to look away. The fire in the hearth was central to northern life. It warmed, it cooked, it illuminated, but it also cauterized. A child learned quickly. Fire could nourish or destroy, and so too with her own strength. If she raised her voice too often, it might invite scorn. If she raised her hand in self-defense, it might be met with laughter or discipline. But slowly, through endurance, through persistence, she could become the kind of fire they didn't try to put out. This was not rebellion. It was survival, made visible. The terrain itself did not indulge weakness. In the fjords and forests, in the wind-swept islands where the sea carved itself into the bones of the earth, life was a slow negotiation with hardship. Storms came without apology. Crops failed. Famine traveled on thin legs and settled into homes uninvited. In such a place, a child who could carry, who could strike, who could understand the rhythm of danger, was not ornamental. She was essential. Even if the word shield maiden was not spoken aloud, even if her training was stitched together from fragments. A cousin who taught her how to balance, a traveling seer who showed her how to breathe through fear. She gathered what she needed. Sometimes she trained with other girls, more often alone. Sometimes she copied what she saw. Sometimes she guessed. But every movement was a petition to be allowed, not by men, by the world itself. In the sagas, it is the woman who remembers, who warns, who waits with resolve. But behind that archetype is this child, forged not in defiance, but in clarity. She did not want war. She understood it. She did not crave blood. She had seen it. On her brother's tunic, in her neighbor's ditch, on the face of the man who returned one limb short from a winter skirmish. War was not spectacle. It was seasonal, predictable, and it did not ask who was ready. It simply came. When it did, she braided her hair tighter. She moved without panic. She did not tremble in the corner. She stood, sometimes on a wall with stones in her hands, sometimes beside the elders with a spear made too tall for her height. She did not claim title. She did not need to. Her presence was an answer. She was born not in the image of a goddess, but in the shape of smoke, curling, elusive, capable of filling whatever space she was allowed. When she was told no, she did not shout. She simply stayed. And so the shield maiden was not made at the edge of a battlefield. She was not summoned by fate. She emerged, slow and unnoticed, from the cold hush of childhood. From watching too much, from losing too early, from braiding herself together again and again. She walked not with the arrogance of destiny, but with the patience of one who had waited long enough. She was not forged by chance. She was forged by fire. And the fire did not burn her, it revealed her. In the northern lands, where stone rings marked the sites of ancient gatherings and oaths were spoken with the weight of breath and consequence, law was not carved in marble. It did not gleam with permanence or claim the illusion of neutrality. It shifted like the snowfields, drifting, melting, hardening, and sometimes vanishing entirely. The laws of the North were alive, shaped by voice and circumstance, molded by the tremors of war, famine, alliance, and necessity. What was allowed could change. What was forbidden could be overlooked, if only for a time. The women of this world were not powerless, but they were watched. A woman could inherit land. She could speak at the Thing, the assembly of free people. She could divorce a husband who struck her or claim her bride gift in the case of betrayal. She could run a farm, command a ship's cargo, offer blood price for a fallen kin. These were not myths. These were protections woven into the tapestry of Viking Age law. But nowhere in the ink of codices or the remembered lines of early lawmen did the sword appear as a birthright for women. And yet it happened. Some reached for it anyway, not because they were permitted to, but because they had measured the cost of silence and found it unbearable. The law did not give them the blade, but it could not stop their hand. In the Icelandic sagas, the so-called grey goose laws, rights are outlined in meticulous, sober rhythm. They speak of boundaries and theft, of blood feuds and inheritance, of who may strike and who must pay. They are not poetic, they are cold, and in their quiet exclusion of women from sanctioned warfare, they reveal what was expected, but they also leave space, gaps, into which lived truth poured itself. The law was not all, it was simply what was written. What was lived, however, wrote itself into different material, into the sagas, into the memory of villages, into the wounds that outlasted law's parchment. Hervor, for instance, is not granted the right to her father's cursed sword by statute. She goes to his grave, demands it, and receives it by sheer force of will. Not from a king, not from a court, from a ghost, from the past, from fire. In that story, there is no legal debate. There is only inheritance by confrontation. And then there is Lagertha, remembered not for what she was allowed to do, but for what she simply did. She took up arms. She fought with cunning and cruelty. She followed Ragnar into war and then walked away from him, unwritten by law but not by consequence. Their stories, preserved in sagas and retellings, do not read like legal testimony. They are filled with contradictions, riddles, discomforts, but they endure because they reflect a deeper legality, not the law of man, but the law of need. When war came, law often bowed its head. A farm needed defending. A village, burned once before, could not risk another undefended night. If a woman could hold a sword and hold her ground, she did not always need approval. She needed opportunity. Sometimes that came in the form of a fallen brother, a vanished husband, a clan dispute that spiraled beyond the reach of protocol. In these moments, she was not permitted. She was essential. The archaeology reflects this quiet truth. Burials of women with weapons have been found far beyond isolated cases, across Sweden, Norway, Denmark. Sometimes the bones tell of trauma, healed or fatal. Sometimes the grave goods speak more loudly than the sagas themselves. A spear where a spindle might have lain. A shield not merely decorative, but worn smooth along the grip. Bronze brooches beside arrowheads. Evidence of lives that did not fit cleanly into written law, but left marks that the ground could not ignore. Modern scholars, for many years, resisted. The tools of analysis were sharp, but the lens was shaped by centuries of expectation. The presence of a sword was explained away as symbolic, as mistaken, as ritual, not reality. But DNA, carbon dating, isotopic analysis, they do not argue. They unfold truth gently, layer by layer, until resistance begins to erode. And so we return to the idea of law. It was never a wall, it was a thread, tangled, dyed, woven tightly and unevenly. It wrapped around power, but did not always define it. Women pulled at it, wove through it, snapped it when necessary. The sagas remembered them, not because they were protected by the law, but because they slipped beneath it, beside it, through it. A woman might not be called a warrior in the law books, but she might be remembered as one by her kin, by the enemies she felled, by the children she raised on stories shaped not by compliance, but by will. And the silence, most of all, could not hold them. Silence is not a neutral space. It is what law uses to erase without writing it down. But the sagas filled that silence with memory, and memory, once spoken, refuses to disappear. When the great stones of Gotland were carved, when the images of women with staffs and swords were etched into permanence, the carvers did not ask permission. They recorded what they knew, what they had seen, what law had left unnamed. These were women who walked outside the sanctioned path, but left footprints so deep that centuries could not cover them. Law did not make space for them, but the world did, briefly, grudgingly, reverently. The law bent under war, under famine, under blood feud. And in those bends, in those creaks and faults, women entered, not quietly, but with care, with force, with memory. They did not need permission. They needed space. And when they found it, they did not ask to be written down. They made themselves unforgettable. There was no school for Shieldmaidens, no hall of instruction where girls were invited to step forward, to be chosen, to be trained. There were no scrolls of rules, no list of approved techniques. The art of battle was not laid before them like bread at a feast. It was guarded, it was reserved. And yet, in the soft hush between frost and sunrise, some girls found a way. Training did not begin with a weapon. It began with a glance, with silence, with observation so precise it became an act of devotion. Brothers sparred in the clearing. Fathers argued over tactics near the hearth. Uncles sharpened blades while speaking of raids, of blood, of what they had done and what they would not forget. The girl watched. She watched not for spectacle, but for detail, for how feet moved, for where weight shifted, for what was allowed and what was hidden. In this world, mimicry was education. Wooden spoons became daggers. Firewood became a staff. A shadow on the wall became an opponent. In the spaces between chores, between feeding goats, hauling water, patching cloth, a girl might find moments, small ones, enough to swing a stick in solitude, enough to practice breath control, to crouch and lunge, to listen for the rhythm that made a blow land true. There were no teachers, only instinct and the quiet memory of what she had seen others do. The ash tree stood at the edge of many northern homesteads. It was not sacred in ceremony, but it was sacred in rhythm. Its branches marked seasons, its roots anchored memory, and for many girls, it marked the border between what was expected and what was possible. Beneath it, hidden from the sight of those who might object, a wooden blade could be swung freely. A bruise could be examined with pride, not shame. A splinter in the palm could be proof of intent. There were no oaths beneath that tree, only breath, only repetition. A girl would move again and again until motion replaced fear, until her limbs remembered what no one had yet told her, until her body began to answer its own questions. Some learned with others, a sister, a cousin, a friend with the same hunger. They formed secret circles, not to defy, but to survive. They whispered corrections. They demonstrated movements in slow pantomime. They copied each other, corrected each other, bled together, and healed. And when they were scolded, for torn skirts, for scraped knees, for time lost. They said nothing of what they had been doing. The training remained unnamed. But it grew. When the first real weapon passed through her hand, a dull blade borrowed in secret or gifted in passing with a look that meant don't tell, it was not the metal that mattered. It was the weight, the feeling of it, the knowledge that this object, made to cut, had entered her grasp. It did not change her, it recognized her, and that was enough. She did not train for glory. She trained because she needed to, because the world around her was not a promise, but a pattern, of raids, of retribution, of winters that took and did not ask. To be untrained was to be unready, and to be unready was to be erased. Training bruised the body, but it steadied the mind. It taught a kind of patience rarely granted to girls. Wait until they forget you are there. Wait until they turn their back. Wait until the opening reveals itself, not in the body of the opponent, but in the structure of the world itself. When no one watches, when no one suspects, that is when the Shieldmaiden forms. And still, there were those who helped. Not openly, but quietly. A brother who, when certain no eyes were upon him, tossed her a practice blade and said nothing. A mother who noticed the bruises but never asked. A grandfather who once fought in the king's wars and showed her, with silent hands, how to fall without breaking the wrist. These were gifts not named as such, but they were remembered. The rituals of training were not ceremonial. They were intimate. The first time blood welled from a split knuckle, it was not a setback, it was a rite. The first time she fell and could not rise immediately, it was not failure, it was fire, reshaping her. No witness applauded, no mentor offered praise. Only the ash tree saw, only the morning mist curled around her breath like smoke around ember. What others called unnatural, she called necessary. What others feared, she embraced, not because she wished for war, but because she understood its nearness. The horizon was not safe. It had never been. And when the horizon darkened with sails, or with winter, or with men who did not see her as worthy of mercy, her training would not ask for justification. It would act. She learned the rhythm of the body, how to shift weight to avoid a blow, how to watch the shoulders, not the hands, how to breathe when struck, how to strike back without trembling. Her fear did not vanish. It became precise. It no longer froze her. It moved with her. It taught her where to place the blade. And when the time came, as it always did, when the longhouse door splintered, or the shouting rose too fast outside the fence, or the smoke of someone else's burning reached her nose, she did not need to ask whether she could fight. She simply stood. There is no saga written of her training, no scald composed verses for the hours she spent beneath the ash tree, skin raw and heart steadying. But the echoes of that practice, repeated across centuries in forests and clearings, on river banks and beneath low skies, shaped the kind of woman the world did not expect but could not forget. She was not granted strength. She built it. She was not taught to fight. She found her way through shadow and splinter, and the ash tree did not question her. It offered shade and silence and space, and in that space she became something unasked, but not undone. In the cold hush of the northern courts, where voices echoed against timbered halls and alliances were stitched with both gold and silence, some daughters were born not into freedom, but into scrutiny. They arrived beneath banners already bloodied, born to noble lineages where inheritance was not promise but burden, and where the whisper of succession could split a clan like frost splits stone. These were not girls sheltered from conflict. They were born into its center. For these daughters, a sword was not rebellion. It was expectation, not declared, not offered, but understood. A right of blood, not bloodshed alone, but of name, of legacy, of survival among kin who would not hesitate to kill to secure their place. They wore their fathers' names like armor, but armor rusts. Armor can become too heavy to carry. And so they learned early that to bear a name of weight, one must also bear a blade. The sagas are quiet on the matter of royal daughters. They mention them in passing. Married off, traded for peace, sometimes exiled for refusing. But between these silences, there are fissures, hints, a figure standing beside a chieftain as a counsel, not a bride. A woman leading warriors after her father's death. A sister who raised a rebellion because her brother's rule was cruel or cowardly. These stories are not center stage, but they return again and again, like breath beneath frost. Among the noble bloodlines, every birth was a calculation, every child a potential alliance, a potential rival, a potential heir. Sons were raised with swords in their hands, and girls, though often placed behind them, were never far from the edge. In a world where loss came fast and inheritance was a game played with knives, even daughters were not exempt from consequence. If a brother fell, the path opened. If a father died, the names scattered like snow, and someone had to gather them. In such families, grief was public. So was ambition. And when a daughter stood beside her brothers in the training yard, it was not novelty, it was necessity. If she bled privately. If she faltered, she did not ask for time. These were not girls who waited to be asked. They watched their cousins fall to poison, to blade, to exile. They understood that nobility did not promise safety. It promised exposure. And so they trained, perhaps more discreetly, but no less fiercely. Their instructors did not call them warriors, but they trained them like ones, because to rule was to defend, and to defend in the north was to kill. Some held lands in their own name when no brother survived. Some commanded war bands when their father aged and their husband had not yet returned. Some were placed at the edge of political marriages, but walked into those halls with their heads high and knives beneath their sleeves. They were not waiting to be saved. They were calculating the line between diplomacy and betrayal. In the Heimskringla, the sagas of the kings, there are moments when queens raise armies, when noble women send messages that shift the outcome of campaigns. Their hands may not hold the sword in every telling, but the blade moves because of them. The silence they command is not compliance, it is leverage. There are glimpses in the historical record, faint but undeniable, in burial mounds bearing the marks of rank and martial presence, in graves containing both regalia and weapons. A woman buried with a ringed pin marking her clan, and beside it a spear, a warrior's adornment beside a queen's necklace. These juxtapositions do not confuse, they clarify. She was not only one thing. No crown gleamed brighter than the one earned in war, not because it was forged in battle, but because it survived it. A daughter who rode into conflict did not return unchanged. She returned unchallenged. Her authority, once decorative, became functional. And yet for all the power such a woman might wield, the battlefield was lonely. For while men were expected to die for their names, women had to defend theirs while also proving they deserved to be present. Their failures were magnified, their victories muted. If a brother fell in war, he was mourned. If a sister fought beside him and lived, her motives were questioned. What did she hope to gain? What had she risked? Why had she stepped forward at all? But the battlefield does not lie. It has no court, no council, only the reckoning of breath and blow. And in those moments, under banners heavy with lineage and snow, the noble daughter ceased to be symbol. She became signal, a standard raised not above the men, but beside them, sometimes ahead of them. It is said that in the far corners of Norway, a woman once led her clan after the death of all her male kin. She was not crowned, but the clans obeyed her, not out of pity, out of necessity. She had the maps, she had the will, and most importantly, she had survived. Her rule was brief, but the fields she walked did not forget her tread. And the sagas. They took note, not because she was noble, but because she was undeniable. Because the silence around her was too large to ignore. Bloodline was not armor. It was provocation. It was a flag that said, "I matter, therefore I must fight." The daughters of kings did not always sit on thrones. Some stood just behind them with hands ready. Some stood in front, alone, unguarded, and still, unshaken. Because to carry a name meant nothing unless one could defend it. And sometimes, the only crown that remained was the one won in battle, earned not in inheritance, but in aftermath. When the long ships returned, gliding like black-throated birds across the gray skin of the sea, they brought more than silver, more than hacked goblets and stitched silks. They brought silence, first, the kind that settles in the throat of those watching from the shore, unsure whether to run or to wait. Then they brought stories, not always spoken, but always felt, in the shifts of posture, in the way men stepped onto land, heavier, quieter, in the sudden stares cast toward the women left behind. The stories clung to salt and smoke. They spoke of women who did not stay behind, who did not wait at the threshold for news of sons and husbands. They spoke of women who boarded, who led, who took to sea not as passengers, but as presents. Some scoffed. Some looked to the horizon in disbelief, but disbelief never shielded anyone from fear. It was presence that stirred the air. At first, these tales were carried like half-truths, wrapped in laughter, in questions. But laughter thins quickly when it touches a bruise, and something in these stories bruised the old certainty that the prow of the Drakkar, the long ship's snarl-shaped front, was no place for a woman. That war and wave were men's domain. That home was the only horizon they were meant to know, but belief was not required for memory to spread. There were captains who told of women steering ships through fog thick enough to swallow shouts, of women who shouted orders hoarser than any chieftain, of raids where a woman's voice was the first sound heard and the last remembered. One tale told of a fleet sighted near the coast of Frankish lands. Black sails, red shields, and at the prow the leading vessel, a woman cloaked in white, hair unbound, eyes unblinking. The monks wrote of it with trembling hands, unsure whether to call her human or omen. They never agreed, but the carvings they etched into vellum, sharp, severe, salt-touched, remembered her. The Drakkar was no sanctuary. It was hunger turned into wood and sail. It had no mercy for hesitation. Wind and oar punished the untrained, the unwilling. That a woman could stand at its prow, even once, was not proof of story. It was proof of survival, of command, of authority earned not in poetry, but in pain. In some northern harbors, when long ships were spotted returning, women would gather first, not to welcome, but to count, to see who came back, to mark who did not. They watched for sons, for fathers, for brothers. But sometimes they watched for daughters, and sometimes those daughters came back, sea-worn, blade-bruised, silent. Their return rewrote everything. Because these were not mythic Shieldmaidens stepped from song. These were women with salt-scabbed skin and hands calloused by rope. Their presence ashore did not ask for recognition. It unsettled it. The villages murmured. Children whispered that she had killed a man twice her size, that she had shouted louder than thunder, that the gods had sent her to remind the earth what fury looked like in a woman's grip. And the songs changed. Skalds, once slow to speak of women beyond the hearth, began to add verses, not of love, of dread, of admiration wrapped in awe and fear. They sang of Hilda, whose ship never took slaves, only vengeance, of Astrid, who tied the sails herself when every man had fallen to fever, of a girl called Svanhild who stood on burning decks and laughed, saying flame and salt were one. Not all these stories were believed, but belief was not what shaped a people. Memory did. Even those who denied the tales would glance at the sea differently after. The sight of a woman near the shipwright's yard stirred something unspoken. The way she coiled rope, the way she watched the waves. These were not gestures of waiting. These were echoes. And in the markets, in the margins of conversation, new words formed. Not to praise, not yet, but to name. To name the unnameable presence of those who had gone and returned. Who had not been permitted, but had gone nonetheless. Who had not been welcomed, but had survived, and in surviving, had taken something from the sea that no man could claim. The sagas later would soften them, fold them into tales of vengeance, of cursed lineage, of brief rebellion corrected by fate. But the oral memory kept something sharper. Villages along the fjords carved warnings into their woodwork, not to ward off ghosts, but to remind. Daughters could return with more than silk. They could return with screams. Some drakars bore women whose names are now lost, whose weapons are dust. But the sea remembers weight, the shore remembers tread, the bone remembers effort. Presence matters more than legend. And so, when the ships rose from the horizon, dark sails backlit by the ash-colored sky, it was not the shape of them that stirred fear. It was the memory, the chance that among the returning warriors would be someone unexpected, someone unwritten, someone who stood not behind, but ahead. At the prow, like a carved warning, and the sea, which never forgets, carried their stories to every coast it kissed, because salt carries sound. And women who ride waves do not vanish. They leave tide behind them. Not all who fought did so for kings, and not all who raised steel did so in the open, with banners and boasts. In the north, beneath the forests thick with ash and pine, and in the spaces left untouched by law or song, there moved women who carried their blades quietly. Not in parade, but in pact. Not in defiance, but in agreement, with each other, and with the unspoken knowledge that survival had no neutral ground. Some fought alone, and that solitude carved them into something harder than legend. But others found each other, not by search, but by recognition. A glance across a training yard, a shared bruise, a silence held a second too long. They did not declare allegiance. They did not bind themselves with rings or runes. Their oaths were made not in words, but in wounds. They fought because no one else would, because what had been taken from them was not only peace, but the right to remain untouched by vengeance. These pacts were not armies. They did not march, and they did not recruit. They moved in pairs, in threes, in scattered circles that touched but never tangled. They did not meet in halls or longhouses. Their place of gathering was the aftermath. The ruins of a homestead, a grave with no mourners, a trail gone cold. Their bond was formed where violence had already spoken, and silence had answered too long. Among the Shieldmaidens, there were those who had never seen war until it came through the door in the form of raiders, or rivals, or betrayal dressed as kin. These were the ones who did not train for glory, but who trained after ruin, who learned because grief demanded it, and when their grief found others, similar in shape if not in story, a pact formed, without names, without hierarchy, just recognition. In one valley, the bones of 3 women were found buried together, ringed by rusted weapons and fragments of shared tools. There was no settlement near them, no clan stones, only the faint remains of what seemed to be a circle once made in the soil. Their remains suggested they died close in time and close in proximity. It was not coincidence. It was community. These were not bands of vengeance hungry for chaos. They were precise. They did not seek blood. They answered it. And when one acted, the others did not ask why. They joined. Because justice, in their pact, was not a process. It was a response. The sagas hint at such women in shadows, in the figures who appear once, strike cleanly, and vanish, in stories where revenge comes swift and is never traced. These characters are rarely named. They are labeled as fate, as bad luck, as warning. But behind those nameless fates stood women with names they never gave. Names that did not need to be remembered, only respected. What bound them was not ideology, it was intimacy. They knew one another not by lineage, but by pain. And in that knowing, they sharpened each other. One taught how to track through snow without leaving a mark. Another how to silence breath. Another still how to strike not first, but last, and always with precision. When they fought, it was rarely for conquest. It was for correction, a redirection of violence back toward its source. They left messages, not written ones, but symbols. A carved feather in the doorframe, a broken arrow laid across a grave. To others, these signs were meaningless, but among the pact, they were maps, coordinates of consequence. Their bond had no leader, no charter, no gatherings of record. If one fell, the others mourned in action. They did not wear black. They did not chant. They simply continued. Vengeance passed from hand to hand, like a torch that burned without ceremony. And if justice was ever achieved, if the blood paid matched the blood lost, they did not declare victory. They vanished, returned to whatever silence had shaped them. Some back to families who never knew, some to woods, some to rivers, to cities, to ships. Their pact required no permanence, only presence. Today, scholars find traces. In graves where weapons are shared but unaligned with formal clans. In stories told in distant villages that mirror each other too closely to be coincidence. In sagas that speak of retribution with no source. They puzzle over them, name them anomalies, but those who listen carefully know. These were not anomalies, they were echoes of a pact. Not written in ink, but in survival. Not led by ambition, but by memory. And justice, when it came, did not need to be loud. It only needed to be accurate. War was never sudden. It arrived slowly, like frost creeping through the joints of wood, settling into the bones of things before anyone dared to name it. In the north, the storm of battle was not always announced by drums or horns. More often, it was preceded by stillness, a silence that filled the longhouse, thick and unmoving, a hush that followed every sentence, that turned laughter into murmur, and in that hush, the women prepared. War, after all, was not only fought in the open, in fields littered with bodies, in rivers turned dark. It began elsewhere, in the rituals no one taught, but everyone knew. Charcoal drawn beneath the eyes, not for disguise, not to frighten, but to steady, to mark the face with focus. The dark lines absorbed the morning sun, hid the tremble behind the eyes, turned softness into steel. It was not about fear, it was about sight, seeing clearly what might come and what might not return. There were herbs, too, not just for healing, for memory. Sprigs of thyme or sweet flag woven into hair, tucked beneath belts, rubbed into wrists. Some for strength, some for clarity, some to carry the scent of home into the unknown. These were not offerings to gods. They were messages to the self. Quiet affirmations braided strand by strand. You are ready. You are not alone. You will return. And on skin, the runes. Not all carved, some inked with soot or ash and spittle, fading within days but sharp when fresh. Protection, some said. For luck. But truly, they were not for gods or fate. They were for the women beside them, for those who would see the mark and know, I have chosen, I am with you. Should I fall, remember this. The Shieldmaidens did not call these things ritual. They did not speak of magic. They moved through their preparation with the rhythm of those who understand. that ceremony is not spectacle. It is survival given shape. They tied leather around wrists rubbed raw from training. They checked straps, edges, layers. They moved without rush, but without pause. Each motion a binding of self to intent. The air before battle was always thick with more than mist. It carried memory, not of past victories, but of past absences. Names unspoken, friends not returned. Sisters who had once stood in that same clearing, touched the same blade, and then vanished into blood and soil. The rituals were not for bravado. They were for grief deferred, for fear acknowledged but not indulged. Some women whispered names into their hands before raising their weapons. Not prayers, promises that they would return, or if not, that they would not be forgotten. They did not always speak aloud, but the body remembered. The flick of the wrist that once traced a rune before sleep, the press of thumb to the blade's spine, the breath drawn in through clenched teeth, released with the steadiness of water over stone. These small acts were their armor, not to prevent harm, but to hold together. Sometimes they laughed, the kind of laughter that sharpens rather than softens. Short, bright, precise, not to forget the weight of what was coming, but to hold it at bay. Humor, too, was a ritual, a shield that did not gleam but held fast. Mothers plaited the hair of daughters. Friends checked each other's bindings. Even those who fought alone did not prepare in isolation. The air between them was shared, heavy with what could not be spoken, and still there was no ceremony. No scald with harp, no incense. Only the sound of fingers brushing wool, the faint scrape of a blade edge across leather, the low sound of breathing in rhythm. In one preserved burial, a woman was found with traces of a rune marked in pigment across her collarbone. It had faded, but not disappeared. Beside her, a blade, a single braid of hair tied with iron thread, and a pouch of crushed herbs long since turned to dust. No clan crest, no symbols of status, only the residue of ritual, intimate, unseen, unbroken. Such rituals did not guarantee victory. They did not summon fate, but they shaped the soul. They reminded the fighter who she was, and who she would carry with her, into the storm. And when the sky finally shifted, when the wind began to push harder from the east, when scouts returned with grim faces and few words, the women did not panic. Their preparations had already begun, not with war cries, but with ritual. Not with armor clattering, but with breath drawn deep and steady. The silence before the storm is where the true battle begins. Not with the enemy, but with the self, against doubt, against sorrow, against the thousand memories that threaten to rise in the last still moment. And in that silence, each ritual becomes an anchor. A hand pressed to a carved charm at the waist, a thumb swiped across the cheekbone, smudging ash. A glance toward a sister, not of blood, but of battle. These are the moments that do not make it into the sagas. But they are where courage is built. Some Shieldmaidens lived, many did not, but none walked into battle without first marking their presence, not for history, for each other. These rites were not taught by elders or sanctioned by kings. They were inherited sideways, from gesture to gesture, breath to breath, and in them lived a wisdom older than war. The understanding that what is remembered does not end, that every ritual, however small, is a thread tying the body to purpose, and that when the storm comes, it does not ask who is brave, it only asks who is ready. And these women, marked in ash, wrapped in herbs, skin inked with quiet power, stood ready, not with gods behind them, but with memory within them, and each other beside them. The shield wall was not an invitation, it was a command, a living barricade of bone and will, where strength was measured not in the swing of a blade, but in the refusal to move. And for most, it was a formation closed to women. not by law but by long memory and the weight of tradition. Yet she stepped toward it anyway, not with ceremony, but with certainty. She did not wait for space. She made it. Step by step, behind the chant of boots striking frost-hardened ground, she walked. The air before battle trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of what was coming. The shield wall loomed ahead, tall with tension, the overlapping wood and iron a breathing thing, flexing with breath and threat. It did not shift to welcome her. It did not part, but she kept walking until breath met breath and the chant no longer moved away, but moved with her. She slipped into its rhythm like water through stone. The line held, not for her, but with her. She had trained in silence, in ritual, in wind-lashed fields where only the ash tree bore witness. But now there was no silence, only the raw sound of steel against shield, of breath clenched behind teeth, of footsteps trying not to falter. The chants began low, steady, repetitive, primal. A grounding hum passed through clenched jaws and tightened cores, and amid them her voice rose. Not louder, but clearer. It was not song, not entirely. It was a line, held in tone, held in pulse, held against the scream of incoming blades. Her voice did not command. It connected to the shield to her left, to the arm to her right, to the earth that had known her shape long before this moment. Steel clashed, wood cracked, and still she sang, not to rouse courage, but to anchor memory. The rhythm she carried was not of war drums, but of names. Names of those who had trained beside her, who had fallen before the line was drawn. Names of sisters who had once carried the same ash branch into the field, who had once sworn, not aloud, but in silence, that they would not be forgotten. Each beat of her voice held a name, each breath a remembrance. She did not sing for glory, she sang for refusal. Refusal to let memory die beneath the noise. The shield wall was not meant to include her, but now, with her voice threading through it, it moved differently. The men around her no longer glanced in confusion. They matched her rhythm, they breathed to her line. Her presence had changed nothing, and everything. There is a history written in stone, of battles won, kings crowned, lines of succession held firm by bloodshed. But beneath that history is a songline, carried not by scribes, but by those who endured. The unnamed, the uncelebrated, the women who stood not behind the wall, but within it, holding fast not because they were allowed, but because they refused to fall. The sagas do not record the song, but they echo its shape. In the cadence of speech, in the pauses between lines, in the silences where grief waits to rise. In each story of vengeance, there is a heartbeat. In each tale of triumph, a name left out. Her chant, steady now amid the fray, was not for victory. It was for memory made muscular. Each repetition a thread that kept her tethered to the purpose she had chosen. She did not fight to win. She fought not to forget. And she was not alone. Others, scattered through the line, picked up her rhythm. Women who had walked 100 different paths to reach the same wall. Some held axes, some only blades, but all held memory. And that memory pulsed through the line until the shield wall was no longer just defense. It was witness. When the enemy struck, hard, brutal, unrelenting, the wall held. Not cleanly, not perfectly. But it did not break, because holding the line was never about strength alone. It was about refusal, to fall, to forget, to vanish. And her voice, cracked now, blood in her mouth, breath short, did not stop. If anything, it deepened, sank lower, became something older than chant, closer to earth, to ancestor, to bone. When the clash ended, when breath was all that remained and the field held more silence than scream, the shield wall sagged. Not broken, but spent. She did not step back. She stayed. And in the stillness, she whispered the final names. Names not of warriors, but of weavers, of daughters, of those who had walked into the long grass and never returned. Each name a closing line, a final breath. Because the shield wall was not made of shields alone, it was made of memory and song. There are battles etched into stone, marked by runes, commemorated with carvings, folded neatly into the sagas that line the shelves of memory. These are the battles that served kings, that shaped the borders of realms, that declared power in names loud enough to last. But there are other battles, quiet in record, loud in consequence. Battles that left no monuments, only absence. And among these is the one that burned the map. It was winter, the kind of winter where breath turns to ice before it leaves the mouth, and snow sharpens rather than softens the land. A raid, they said, though no one remembered who started it. The sagas spoke of it in one line, almost in passing. A conflict between two rival jarls, vying for control of a stretch of coast long splintered by dispute and debt. The kings were named, their banners described, their bloodlines dutifully traced. But in the village where the soil still bears black beneath the frost, they tell of someone else. A woman, a shield maiden, not royal, not recorded, and yet central. She was not the beginning of the battle, nor its declared victor, but she became its reckoning. The story lives not in scrolls, but in fragments. In the melted iron twisted into earth near the shoreline, in the half-buried blade found beneath a collapsed hearth, too delicate for a standard warrior's grip, yet honed to a brutal edge, in the shape of a scorched longhouse where no one rebuilt. These are not symbols of strategy, they are shadows of survival. They say she charged when others hesitated, not because she sought glory, but because she saw the line faltering, the ice cracking, the breath of defeat already forming. She ran not toward victory, but toward interruption. A single figure across the snowfield, small against the winter sky, loud not in voice, but in motion. And in that motion, the battle turned. Not in her favor, but in its shape. What followed was not conquest, it was collapse. The shield wall ruptured, the lines blurred. The map, so carefully maintained in halls and courts, was burned, not by fire, but by the impossibility of continuing as before. The coast, once claimed, was left abandoned. Neither side could justify the cost. The kings moved on, their eyes found other coasts, their songs found other victories. But the screams of that day remembered her. It is said that she did not fall in the charge, that she was seen, hours later, dragging wounded through the ash, that her hands, bloodied, frost-bitten, closed the eyes of enemies and kin alike, and then she vanished. No one claimed her body, no grave bears her name, only the soil speaks, scorched deeper where she stood longest, as if the earth itself chose to carry the memory. No monument remains. But sometimes history is not a stone. It is a scar. The map, when redrawn, left that village unnamed, left the coastline curved differently. What had once been marked as a stronghold became blank space, not erased, refused. The silence was deliberate, and in that silence her story grew. Children of the nearby fjords learned to fear that stretch of land, not for ghosts, but for memory too heavy to hold. Skalds, when pressed, would mutter of a winter, charge that disrupted everything, a woman with no banner, a fury that no one predicted and no one controlled. And still the sagas clung to kings. Their victories were counted in land gained, hers in the land no one returned to. Their names are carved in halls. Hers is known only in the tremble of a fisherman's voice, describing a bay he will not anchor in. Archaeologists, years later, would puzzle over the odd concentration of melted iron near the coast, the strange absence of burials, the partial remains of weapons fused together in unnatural shapes, the pattern of burning that seemed both strategic and chaotic. There was no alignment with any formal battle map. It did not fit, but survival rarely does. She did not change the world by leading it. She changed it by enduring it, by refusing to disappear, even when the names forgot her, by becoming the scar the kings could not rewrite. There are maps that show only terrain, rivers, forests, coasts, and there are maps that show power, boundaries, clans, inheritance. But the map she left was different. It was not drawn, it was felt. A boundary of memory where history chose not to build, not to name, not to claim. That was her monument, unmarked, unyielding, and unforgettable. For centuries they called her a myth, a beautiful fiction threaded into the sagas by skalds who loved symmetry more than truth. A symbol, perhaps, of a people's yearning, but not a person. Certainly not someone who had breathed the frost-bitten air of the north, who had felt the bruising weight of a shield, who had once looked into another's eyes and made the decision not to step back. The shield maiden, they said, was a metaphor, an echo, a dream embroidered onto the fabric of history, not woven through it. But then a grave opened, and the earth, which had held its silence so patiently, spoke. It was a small hill, unremarkable to most. A burial mound, like many others, settled into the landscape outside the old town of Birka. Time had softened its edges. Wind and root had tried to erase it. But when the archaeologist's spade struck the first layer of packed soil, something old stirred. A story that had refused to disappear had been lying just beneath the surface. She was not buried with beads or combs or the silver clasps of domestic peace. She was buried with a sword, one woman, one blade. The skeleton lay angled, deliberate, surrounded by the remnants of war, a shield, a bow, 2 horses, the tools of a strategist, and at her hip, the sword. A warrior's sword, not ceremonial, not symbolic, not set there as decoration, but placed where the hand could once reach. The blade that had moved with her, struck with her, protected her. Its presence was not whisper, it was declaration. At first, assumptions leapt to the fore. A warrior's grave, therefore a man. Of course. The inventory was too complete, the honors too great. This was a high-ranking fighter, likely a commander, one who had known clamor of battle and the silence after. That this body had narrower hips, finer bones, that it lacked the typical markers of male biology, was noted, but set aside. It did not fit expectation. And so, for decades, it was filed under belief, not bone. But truth is patient. When science returned to the grave centuries later, it asked fewer questions and listened more closely. DNA does not argue, it does not care for the noise of tradition, and the strands it unwound told the story plainly. She was a woman, and she had been buried not as a wife, nor mother, nor keeper of hearth, but as a warrior. The archaeologist's hands trembled, not in disbelief, but in recognition of the quiet betrayal that history had performed, not once, but repeatedly. The betrayal of assuming absence because of silence, of assuming myth because memory had worn a woman's face. She was not an anomaly. She was the evidence that had long been denied breath. Her arms bore the marks of labor, not of loom or spindle, but of draw and strike. Muscles shaped by repetition, by carrying, by readiness. Her spine was worn from riding. Her legs bore the compression of time in stirrups. These were not metaphorical wounds. They were not literary devices. They were lived. And her placement within the grave, its symmetry, its reverence, spoke loudly. She had been honored, not hidden. Still, debate clung. The old frameworks resisted. Perhaps the weapons were tokens. Perhaps the burial was symbolic. But none of these explanations held under the weight of detail. No one else buried like her had ever been considered anything less than a warrior. To deny her now was not science. It was fear. Fear of what her presence dismantled. She did not ask to be remembered, but she had been impossible to forget. And now, with her bones laid bare to the air once more, her story returned, not as invention, but as reminder. That the stories whispered across generations, half believed and half denied, had always held a pulse. That beneath the earth, the women who fought had never vanished. They had only been buried. She became a wound in the archive, a crack in the edifice of certainty. And through that crack, many others emerged. Other graves, once dismissed, were reconsidered. Other weapons, once dismissed as decorative, were weighed anew. Not all would yield such clarity, but the question had changed. It was no longer, did she exist? It was, why did we pretend she didn't? History, it turned out, had been caught hiding. And she, buried with her blade, had waited long enough. She was not called Shieldmaiden. The title was too small for her, too narrow to hold the breadth of what she became. She bore no nickname carved by awe or hesitation. No whispered moniker passed from hearth to harbor. She had a name and a crown. But even that crown could not explain her. She was queen, and she rode into battle just the same. Her armor was not lacquered gold or soft-stitched finery. It bore no flourishes meant to dazzle, no excess weight of ceremony. It was practical. Hardened leather, dented iron, laced together by the hands of those who knew she would wear it not for parade, but for war. The dents in the breastplate told of blows absorbed. The dried, darkened stains of wounds weathered, survived, and never confessed. She did not speak often. She did not need to. Her presence was instruction. The sagas praised her husband, his lineage, his victories, his clever words before battle, and his boldness in the fray. His deeds were carved into memory, as was expected of men who wore the mantle of kingship. But it was her funeral that the skalds sang longest. Not because she ruled in his shadow, but because she shaped a kingdom alongside him. And when he fell, she did not wait to mourn. She led. History likes to say that women like her were exceptions, outliers. But the soil says otherwise. The bones of women buried with regalia and weaponry, the remnants of crowns nestled beside swords, suggest that sovereignty was not always male and that leadership did not always come from the throne alone. In places like Oseberg, the burial of two women, one of them likely royal, revealed a funeral prepared with reverence and martial memory. Among the grave goods, a cart, textiles, a bedpost carved with dragons, and tools of domestic and ritual significance, but also axes, shields, and ship fittings. A mixture that did not confuse, it confirmed. This queen ruled with blade and silence. Her voice, when raised, was not for poetry, it was for direction. In battle, she did not wait behind the lines or linger in the tower. She rode ahead, cloak drawn close, eyes on the horizon, and her army followed not because she demanded it, but because she moved like someone who had already paid the price of hesitation. The sagas, in fragments, hint at such women. Of Alder, the deep-minded, who crossed oceans and founded new settlements. Of Thornbjörg, who refused marriage and ruled by force. Of women whose names survive not through policy, but through persistence. Their power was not gifted, it was enacted. Lived. Our queen, unnamed in the surviving texts, but etched in ritual, knew the burden of both crown and command. She held councils, but she also held the line. She rode into the storm when others trembled. She bore her husband's loss without faltering. Her sons too young, her rivals too eager. The weight of rule fell onto her shoulders, and she did not flinch. They say she struck the first blow in the final campaign, not as provocation, as promise, that she stood at the center of the shield wall, not flanked by guards, but surrounded by those who had trained under her command. Her blade was curved from use. Her stance, grounded. She did not call herself warrior. She did not need to. She governed through ritual too. In the quiet acts of morning preparation, in the ceremonies of harvest and healing, in the way she walked her halls without needing to speak her own name. Her people recognized her not by decree, but by presence. When she died, the land mourned differently, not in great fires or wealth given to the sea, but in the stillness that followed. It was said that the wind did not rise for 3 days, that the ravens kept to the forests, that the sound of weeping in the village did not come from the widowed king, but from those who had once ridden behind her, who had once seen her stand when all others knelt. The skalds, bound by tradition to elevate the king's legacy, found their verses drifting, their stanzas stretched longer in her name. They spoke of her posture, of her silence, of the way her eyes fixed not on her enemies, but on the future they would never control. Her funeral song, passed from court to countryside, was sung in lower tones, slower rhythm, as if grief itself had to be carved carefully to make room for her. They burned her with her blade, not folded beside her, not tucked beneath her, placed across her chest, its edge dulled by ash and time, but its purpose unchanged, to honor the life of a ruler who had defended with steel and led with stillness. The mound where she rests is overgrown now. Trees encroach. Moss cloaks the stone. No marker names her. But in nearby villages, when storms rise quickly and decisions must be made, they still speak of her, not with grandeur, with respect. She was not called Shieldmaiden, but she broke every expectation of the crown, and ruled not by birthright, but by blade. The more she rose, the more the ground shifted beneath her, not from instability, but from resistance. It was not the sword that broke her momentum. It was the scroll, not the wound, but the word. As the memory of women who fought began to settle into legend, the laws changed their shape. Not all at once, not loudly, but in careful, quiet whispers that hardened over generations. At first, there were no words against her, just silence. And in that silence, space. Space to train, to defend, to lead. But as her presence grew harder to ignore, in the sagas, in the bones, in the battlefield tales passed down by those who had fought beside her, the silence became something else, something thinner, less forgiving. Edicts began to narrow the doorways through which she had once walked. A clause here naming inheritance as a male line. A phrase there excluding women from command in times of war. Script became the gatekeeper, and with every new rule, the memory of her was pushed further toward the edges, toward the corners of myth and danger. It was not her strength they feared, it was her refusal to vanish. By the 12th century, as Christian scripture poured into the northern world, the battlefield was no longer just fought with blades, but with belief. New saints replaced old warriors. New virtues replaced old rhythms. The woman who raised a shield was now cast not as fierce, but as disobedient. The sagas were rewritten to soften her or erase her. And still, she remained, even when she was called unnatural. That word, spoken by monks, etched in parchment, folded into sermons, was meant to shame, to reframe her courage as transgression, her leadership as imbalance, her autonomy as threat, but unnatural only means unwelcome by men. And even unwelcome things survive, because law may write her out of inheritance, but it cannot unweld the blade from her grip. It cannot erase the scar she earned defending a coast long since renamed. It cannot unbraid the hair that once carried herbs for memory, or silence the rhythm she led in the shield wall. Words may narrow her, but they cannot undo her. Women continued to fight, even as they stopped being named for it. They dressed as men, hid their lineage, rode under false banners or no banners at all, not because they sought deception, but because the law no longer made space for truth. The girl with the ashwood staff no longer trained in open fields. She trained behind barns, in caves, in the dark, where the page could not see her. But she trained nonetheless, because she had stopped asking. As the Middle Ages stretched on, the memory of women in war became a shadow, hinted at in fables, dismissed in courts. The law solidified, growing thick with exclusions. Women could not inherit arms, could not lead troops, could not testify to acts of war unless confirmed by men. The doors closed, but the footsteps remained outside them. In some rural places, the stories still pulsed. A woman who once drove off raiders with a pitchfork, another who rode disguised for 2 winters and led a retreat that saved a village. These tales were not printed, but they were past, and what is past becomes promise, even if not yet practice. The laws feared her not because of what she had done, but because of what she might still do, because every rule written in ink is a sign that someone already broke it. And her survival had not been in defiance. It had been in endurance. When they narrowed the laws, she narrowed her steps. When they blurred the battlefield, she learned to strike from within the fog. When they declared her unnatural, she leaned into it until her very existence became a disruption they could not fully contain. By the time she returned to history, it was archaeology that welcomed her. The sword buried at her hip, the arrowheads near her ribs, the wear on her spine. Truth written in bone where ink had failed. And even now, when her stories are told anew, when the sagas are read again with clearer eyes, the laws that once buried her crack at the edges. Because history cannot remain hollow, it collapses under its own omissions. She did not need permission to rise. She needed only to stop waiting for it, and so she did. She was not broken by law. She outlasted it. Not every shield maiden was named. Many lived between lines, in the pause between verses, in the margin of maps, in the breath held before battle. Some disappeared into the chaos of war, unburied, unpraised, their stories never told. Others dissolved into warnings whispered to daughters, not to frighten them, but to prepare them, to pass down the quiet truth that not all power is written, and not all survival wears a crown. They were not erased. They were absorbed into the rhythm of the wind against the longhouse walls, into the weight of the braided hair pulled tight before work, into the instinct to reach for a blade or a word when danger calls. The sagas, careful and political, name the kings, the sons, the husbands. They carve their stories in full. But the women who fought, who endured, who made battle with blade or voice or silence, their memory was carried differently. Not as legacy, as energy. They lived on in the tension beneath custom, in the raised eyebrow at tradition, in the girl who learned to strike a flint before she learned to speak, in the mother who taught her daughter not only to weave, but to watch. This is the echo of defiance, the inheritance unclaimed but never lost. In some villages, long after the age of Drakkars and raids, tales still passed from fire to fire, of a woman who walked alone into the mountains after the last of her kin was taken, of a figure who stood at the edge of a fjord and shouted back at a war band until they turned away, of someone who, when her son was taken as hostage, burned 3 settlements before naming the price of his return. These stories don't begin with names. They begin with weather, with storms that rose too suddenly, with nights too quiet to trust. They begin with daughters who noticed something others missed, a change in breath, a wrongness in the air. They begin with memory, not as history, but as instinct. In the north, the weather remembers. It carries things. A voice once shouted into a gale will travel centuries if the wind wants it to. And when a daughter lifts her voice now, not always in war, not always in defiance, but in clarity, something stirs, something old, something patient. The forgotten storm does not end when it is ignored. it waits. And when a woman speaks what has long been silenced, not with permission, but with precision, the storm answers. Not in rage, in recognition. Because the storm remembers them. The women who stood in the shield wall without praise. The ones who trained beneath the ash tree when no one watched. The ones who braided herbs into their hair and runes into their skin and walked into danger because no one else would. The ones who never asked if they were allowed. When their daughters rise, whether with sword or with silence, the old gods stir with them, not because the gods command them, but because they are kin. There are no monuments for these women, no stone halls that echo with their names. But there are signs, subtle ones, the shape of a grave that does not match its inscription, the old iron buried with someone marked only as wife, the corner of a saga where a name is written once and never again, though everything that follows bears her shadow. Even now in museums, in archives, in collections of broken tools and rusted blades, their presence waits. In the tilt of a sword too small for standard issue, in the healed fracture of a rib once broken in battle, in the fragment of a carved comb with a single rune hidden beneath its base. Ekemeki ein, I am not alone. They never were, even when unnamed, even when denied, even when dismissed. They were part of something larger than armies. They were the storm that followed silence. And in every generation, when a girl learns the weight of her voice or the shape of resistance in her hands, she steps into that storm, not with fear, but with lineage. She may not know their names, but their echo is in her lungs. And when she breathes, the storm breathes too. A comb, a brooch, a sword, 3 objects, each no larger than a forearm, rested in the earth with equal stillness. They had lain there for centuries, undisturbed, untouched, arranged with the solemn care of farewell. When the archaeologists brushed away the centuries of soil, they uncovered not just remnants of a life, but the aftermath of a silence too long preserved. The grave did not shout, but the objects within it refused to whisper. A comb, delicate, carved with quiet artistry, meant for grooming, for ritual, for continuity. A brooch, bronze, curved like a crescent, its face smooth from touch, meant to fasten fabric close to the skin. These were objects that had long been catalogued as markers of the domestic, the feminine, the familiar. Their presence was expected. But beside them lay a sword. Not a ceremonial blade, but a warrior's. Sharpened, weighted, and placed not at a respectful distance, but directly within reach of the skeleton's side. The kind of blade shaped by function, not by ornament. Meant to move, meant to kill. The scholars gathered around the burial site puzzled. The bones told them one story. Narrow hips, smaller frame, the anatomical markers that quietly, insistently pointed toward a female body. The comb and brooch nodded in agreement, but the sword interrupted. It contradicted. It demanded attention in a voice the others did not raise, and the archaeologists hesitated. They asked, which objects told the truth? Was she a woman marked for domesticity, buried with tokens of her gender, and the sword placed there in error, or as a symbol? Or was she a warrior, whose comb and brooch had simply traveled with her as part of her full self, a self that had no need to choose between battlefield and home? The question itself was revealing. It presumed that identity could be divided, that a warrior could not wear a brooch, that a woman could not wield a sword, that death must speak in categories. But burial goods do not lie. They only wait to be read correctly. The grave had not been arranged in confusion. It had been arranged with reverence. Someone had loved her. Someone had prepared her body with deliberate care. The comb was polished, the sword oiled before burial. The brooch pinned the shroud closed with final grace. There was no contradiction, only assumption. For decades, the find was labeled anomalous, an exception, a curiosity. The grave was marked as female, but the inventory recorded a possible symbolic weapon. The hesitation echoed across papers and footnotes, each one trying to make the sword smaller, the woman more invisible. But the grave did not change. It waited. And when science returned, with gentler hands, with newer tools, with minds less fixed on tradition, it listened again. DNA confirmed what the bones had always suggested. This was a woman, not possibly, not questionably. And the sword? The sword was hers. She had not borrowed it. She had not inherited it in death. She had carried it. The reading had changed, and in that reading, she rose again. No longer the shadow in the footnotes, no longer the unnamed exception. She became what she had always been. Evidence, not just of her own life, but of the lives like hers. The ones whose graves had been misread, whose artifacts had been separated into neat piles of domestic and martial, feminine and masculine, acceptable and unexplained. She unsettled those borders. She stepped into the center of a history that had not made room for her. The comb still mattered. So did the brooch. But now they were not opposites of the sword. They were companions. They painted a fuller portrait. A woman who groomed herself, who dressed with care, who prepared, and who also fought. The sword did not silence the comb. It completed it. And slowly, other graves were reconsidered. Other burial sites once labeled ambiguous or symbolic were opened again, not with the expectation of contradiction, but with the curiosity of possibility. What had once spoken too loudly was finally being heard, and it echoed. In lecture halls, in new articles, in exhibitions where girls stood before the display of a woman's sword and saw something that made them stand straighter, because the past had not changed. The listening had. This woman, this warrior, had never asked to be argued over. She had simply lived, fought, died, and been laid to rest with all of who she was. The grave was her story, and now, finally, it was being read aloud. They tried to soften her. When her presence became too sharp, too insistent to ignore, they took to the sagas with gentle hands and veiled intentions. She was folded into metaphor, woven into the corners of stories, made to stand not as herself, but as symbol. Her blade, once lifted in defense and vengeance, was reshaped into allegory. Her name, when it appeared at all, was surrounded by phrases of wonder, of deviation, of unnatural things. She became a curiosity, a caution, a footnote dressed in silk, but her blade slipped through the verses. Even, softened, she remained. Even when called maiden instead of warrior, even when praised for her beauty before her skill, even when placed on the battlefield beside men but never allowed to lead, she still stood. Not because the skalds permitted her, but because the stories could not hold without her. There are passages where her voice is written as echo, distant, filtered through the lens of a male narrator, broken into indirect speech or poetic lament, and still it bruises the page. Her words carry a weight that sagas could not fully dilute. When she curses, it thunders. When she commands, it cuts. When she weeps, the sagas flinch, unsure whether they have betrayed her or preserved her. The poets tried to use her. They cast her as a test for male heroes, a woman to be conquered in battle, only to be married by the tailor's end. Or a phantom presence, doomed by ambition, punished for stepping beyond the hearth's boundaries. But something in her stories resists. She never fades fully into compliance. Even when written to fall, she falls with her hand clenched. Even when told to love, her love carries condition. She's not safe. She is not soft, and the page cannot hold her without trembling. Every omission speaks her name louder. For each saga that refuses to name her, for every battle account that lists the fallen but not the one who turned the tide, her absence marks the space more sharply than her presence would have. History, when forced to erase, leaves an outline, a hollow, a shape that calls attention to itself by the very act of removal, and readers feel it. They pause where the story skips. They notice the blow described but not attributed. They sense the hand that must have moved, though no name is given. Even silence, over time, begins to bend toward her return. Because history is not a closed door. It is a corridor with echoes. The louder the effort to suppress, the more resonant the truth becomes. The woman whose blade was struck from the story does not vanish. She becomes a vibration beneath every word. And as each generation reads the sagas anew, with different eyes and sharper questions, she becomes harder to ignore. There are lines in Hervara saga that speak of a daughter demanding her father's cursed sword, though no one will give it. She raises an army, she rides into death, and yet the tale insists on returning her to the domestic, as if war was a dream she briefly walked through. But her command, her defiance, her unflinching presence, these are not dreamlike. They are rooted. They are real. In Saxo Grammaticus, Lagertha appears fierce and cunning, a warrior who earns the respect of men by outmaneuvering them. But by tale's end, she is married off, and her strength folded into romantic narrative. Still, the reader remembers her arrival, her sword drawn, her hair unbound, her commands obeyed. She enters the saga as Storm. No marriage can unmake that. And Freydis, daughter of Erika the Red, is called monstrous in some tellings. Her violence too extreme, her rage too dangerous. Yet she survives. Her brutality mirrors the men around her, yet it is framed as shame. And still, the story cannot forget her. She stands pregnant and alone, sword drawn, daring the enemy to strike. They don't. Even in condemnation, she dominates the frame, so the sagas did not want to lose her. They wanted to tame her. But she could not be tamed, and so she slipped between categories, neither fully praised nor fully erased, existing in the edge space of story, where truth hides when the world isn't ready to receive it. Archaeology has unearthed what the sagas tried to bury: bones that do not lie, swords placed beside the pelvises of women, arrowheads beside brooches, graves that speak with clarity where the page trembles. But the sagas matter too, because even in their silences, they left the trail, the outline, the room. And now, we enter it. She rises not because we invent her, but because we recognize her, in the footnotes, in the ellipses, in the lines where no name is given, but the weight of presence cannot be denied. She returns not through revision, but through rereading, not to be glorified, but to be acknowledged, not because the sagas allowed her voice, but because she used it anyway. The phrase was never meant to be taken literally. No one soaked in kings. No queen lifted a goblet of blood with dainty fingers and smiled while courts gasped. No shield maiden poured gore into a basin and cleansed herself of doubt. That image, so favored by later tellings, by the minds that needed spectacle to explain power, was myth built upon fear. The fear of a woman who had not only survived war, but owned its memory, because blood was never bathwater. Blood was proof. Proof that something had been claimed, that something had been lost, that power in the North did not flow from titles or robes, but from what a person was willing to risk, and what they refused to surrender. In that world, power had a scent. It was coppery, bitter, and unmistakable. And yes, women walked through it, but not as butchers, as witnesses, as leaders who had seen too much to stay quiet and endured too much to be denied. They did not wash in blood, they wore it, not with pride, with purpose, because the stain reminded others of what had been survived and what would not be repeated. She did not bathe in gore. She bathed in memory. In the memory of brothers who fell in fields still soft with spring. In the memory of towns set aflame by men who never looked back. In the memory of sons taken before their voices changed. In the memory of the one moment she was told she would never hold the blade. And the next, when she did. She carried those memories not behind her eyes, but on her skin. A scar across the collarbone, a thin line behind the ear, a healed wrist where she once blocked too late. These were not trophies, they were citations. Proof that she had passed through fire and returned. Not clean, but clear. Power in the North was not ceremonial, it was situational. It bent toward the ones who showed up when the hall was empty, when the fields were burning, when the map was no longer reliable. The woman who rose then, without waiting, without asking, was not bathing in chaos. She was commanding it. Later, chroniclers, uncomfortable with the reality of women who ruled by presence rather than permission, reimagined them, turned them into devourers, drenched them in exaggeration, called them unnatural, bloody, vicious. But what they truly feared was not cruelty. It was clarity. The clarity of a woman who did not flinch at the cost of leadership, who did not hide her scars behind silk, who did not cleanse herself of what she had endured, but instead let it shape her decisions. These were rulers who remembered every price paid, every scream unanswered, every mercy withheld. They sat on thrones not to mimic kings, but to correct them, and the thrones remembered. Wood remembers weight, stone remembers pressure, and the memory of those women still stains the throne rooms of men, not with blood, but with the silent presence of judgment, because they ruled differently. Not softly, but precisely. They did not punish as theater. They did not rage for power's sake. They made choices sharpened by memory. They understood the cost of every order because they had once been the ones obeying them or refusing them. In one tale, later redacted by nervous scribes, a queen was said to have ordered the execution of a traitor with no words. She stood, pointed once, and left. The act was not done in fury. It was done in finality. She did not need to perform vengeance. She had become it. Even centuries later, their names stir unease, because they require us to admit that history lied, that the blood these women carried was not a metaphor, and not madness. It was leadership, lived leadership, the kind that walks the battlefield at dusk, not to count bodies, but to name them. The throne is a difficult seat. It demands forgetfulness. But these women did not forget, and so they do not fit. They haunt. Their legacy is not a song. It is a pressure in the air, the feeling that someone is watching the decisions made in modern halls, that someone remembers what cost was once paid for ease, for ambition, for war declared too quickly. And when their stories are retold, not as monsters, not as myths, but as people, the room shifts. Suddenly, the crown weighs differently. The title breathes harder, because the blood is still there, not to horrify, to remind. Power is not pure. It never was. But when wielded by someone who remembers the storm, who wears the scar like a map, it becomes something else, something steadier, something earned. She bathed in memory, and that memory endures, not in poetry, not in warning, but in every decision that dares to call itself leadership. When the cross reached her shore, it did not come quietly. It came with bells and robes, with scrolls and sermons. It came not just to convert, but to overwrite, to take what had been sung and spoken, and script it in ink, in Latin, in lines that could not hold her shape. With Christianity came the script, and with script came erasure. The old world had been oral, living, imperfect but porous. It made room for contradiction, for silence, for memory shaped like weather. It allowed a woman to rise with a sword if the village needed her, if the gods permitted, if grief pushed her forward. She didn't always have a name, but she had a place. But the new faith had rules, and names, and positions, and she wasn't in them. The sword was asked to kneel. The sagas softened her just as scripture scorched her. The church called the battlefield a man's burden, and the pulpit a man's domain. Woman was to be helpmate, to submit, to carry grace and burden without steel. And so the Shieldmaiden, the queen who led from the front, the daughter who never waited to be asked, she was rewritten, or worse, forgotten. Some did kneel, not out of surrender, but survival. They tucked away their blades, buried their past in story, and stepped into the roles newly carved for them: nun, wife, widow, servant. They prayed with the same intensity they once brought to training. They endured. But inside, some carried the weight of silence like they once carried swords, with purpose and with pain. Others shattered instead, not in body, in legacy. Their names scrubbed, their stories framed as scandal, their leadership reframed as defiance, heresy, wildness. They became warnings. Don't be like her. Don't raise your voice. Don't take up arms. The church had no liturgy for women like that, so it made them ghosts. And still, she remained, because history remembers what faith forgets, especially when the bones speak clearer than books. The ground never converted. It kept its memory intact. Beneath the monasteries built over old battlefields, beneath the chapels raised on sacred groves, the graves did not change their story. Women buried with weapons, with wounds, with honors. Even as the scrolls refused to mention them, the archaeologists would come later and dig and find what scripture had hidden, not with lies, but with silence. In one case, a woman buried near a Christian churchyard. Her bones were narrow, her pelvis unmistakably female, but her grave goods. A sword at her side, a shield pressed into the soil beside her, and fragments of iron near her ribs. Arrowheads. She had been wounded, she had healed. She had returned to fight again. There was no cross in her grave, only memory, intact. The priests had called her unclean. The idea of a woman who killed, who bled without childbirth, who raised her voice without being asked. It unsettled the hierarchy. Purity, as the church defined it, did not leave room for her. But purity was never her pursuit. Her pursuit was survival, and justice, and remembrance. And so she endured, not in the churches, but in the fields, in the unmarked burials on windswept coasts, in the stories mothers told their daughters beneath their breath, when the priest had passed and the door was shut, in the carved motifs on loom weights, where women etched not patterns, but warnings, in the quiet strength of a girl who did not ask permission to speak. And when the books forgot her, the bones did not. When the scripture erased her, the sagas faltered, but could not quite follow through. She had already cut too deep into the rhythm of memory. Too many stories began with her silence. Too many battles turned on her hand. Too many children carried names that once belonged to her. So now, when we look back, we see both: the faith that asked her to vanish, and the history that kept her anyway. She may not have stood in the cathedral, but she stood in the doorway, watching, waiting, enduring, because memory outlives doctrine, and the blade, even when buried, still carries its weight. No statues rise for her. No marble plinth bears her name. No bronze blade points skyward in honor. The cities have forgotten. The temples, repurposed. The scrolls, where they mention her at all, do so with caution, if not contempt. She does not sit in museums crowned in gold. She does not live in public holidays or schoolroom timelines. But the earth still holds her shape. Beneath fields now quiet with wheat, with snow, with centuries of unremarkable silence, she waits, not as ghost, not as threat, as memory, unburied but not yet seen. In these meadows, where the grasses bow easily in the wind, once there was shouting, once there was blood, once a shield wall rose and broke, and among it stood a woman not asked to be there, but there nonetheless. Her feet pressed the same soil that now grows barley. Her breath once clouded in air that now smells only of rain. She does not remain in statue, she remains in contour. Bones, once forgotten, now surface with gentler hands. They are not pristine. They are cracked, worn, weathered, but they speak. The pelvis curved not by birth alone, but by riding. A forearm once broken and healed uneven. A collarbone with a small, unmistakable groove of an arrow's near miss. These are not marks of myth. They are proof. The graves were often shallow, not out of disrespect, but urgency. The field did not wait. The dead were folded into the ground quickly, wrapped in wool or leather, sometimes alone, sometimes side by side, with friend, with kin, with horse. In some, a sword rests quietly against the ribs. In others, the hands still curve as if they remember gripping a haft. She's not the only one. There are many. Too many for the old excuse of exception. Too many to be dismissed as accident. Woman after woman, uncovered with steel at their side, with bone-worn shoulders, with the wear of survival carved into the skeleton itself. None of their graves marked with title, but all of them titled by time. The land did not forget them. It kept their form in full, the shape of a life lived forward. Not within the lines, not within the roles assigned, but where she was needed, where she chose to stand. Not to return, but to be named. That is what history has been turning toward, slowly, clumsily, like a beast unsure it wants to face what it overlooked. The naming, not invention, not rewriting, just recognition. She is not myth, she is not fiction, she is bone beneath field, she is evidence. When we speak of her now, we speak not only of possibility, but of presence, not only of rebellion, but of participation. The woman who stood with sword, with song, with silence, is not emerging from fantasy. She is emerging from the dirt, and the whisper of her remains has never stopped breathing. It has breathed in the spaces between words, in the sagas where her name is replaced by someone, in the grave goods too often misread as symbolic, in the rhythm of stories passed down from mother to daughter, never written, always known. She breathes in the rereading of evidence, in the trembling of archaeologists' hands, when the bones speak clearer than the books. In the realization that what was once dismissed as anomaly is, in fact, inheritance. No statue needed. She rises through the soil, through the retelling, through the breath of those who will not forget her again. She waits, not for resurrection, for remembrance.